This is my true story. After working my whole life to raise my family, I thought my old age would be filled with respect and care. Instead, I was treated like nothing. One night, after a small argument, my own family locked me in the bathroom. They left me there for 2 days, with no food, no water, and no dignity. I sat in the darkness, listening to their laughter, wondering if I would even survive. But I did survive. And when I came out, I made a choice that changed everything. You won't believe what I did next. Before I tell you, tell me where you're watching from, and please subscribe. From the moment I became a father, my life was no longer about me. Every decision, every sacrifice, every ounce of strength I had was poured into building a future for my family. I worked through the blazing heat of summers and the freezing bite of winters, often on aching knees and a tired back, because I wanted them to have the comfort I never knew. Long shifts, endless overtime, and sleepless nights became my reality. I carried heavy loads with blistered hands, stood on assembly lines until my legs burned, and took every extra job that no one else wanted. It was not for wealth or luxury. It was for them, my children, my blood, the people I believed would one day stand by me the way I stood by them. Every bill that came through the door had my name on it. When they were young, I paid school fees that seemed impossible for my income. I skipped meals so they would eat better. I patched my old clothes so they could wear new ones. When medical emergencies came, I was there with whatever money I could gather, selling valuables, borrowing when I had no choice, and sacrificing without hesitation. When one child wanted to attend university, I emptied my savings account without a second thought, telling myself that education was the one gift that could not be stolen. When another faced debt after poor decisions, I covered it quietly, never shaming them, never holding it against them. I built a roof over their heads, a home with warmth and safety, because I wanted them to feel secure, to feel proud of where they came from. Year after year, I put myself second. My back grew weaker, my hair turned gray, and my body carried the scars of decades of hard labor. But I wore those scars with pride because they meant my family lived in comfort. While I sat at the table with tired hands, they enjoyed meals that came from my labor. While I dragged myself to work sick, they stayed warm and safe at home. Every penny I earned was stretched to cover their needs. Medical bills, groceries, car repairs, school trips, even luxuries they wanted but didn't truly need. I found a way to provide. I told myself that one day, when age caught up with me, they would look back and remember these sacrifices. I told myself they would say, "Father gave everything for us, and now it is our turn to give back." But what I believed to be strength, they began to see as weakness. They took my giving nature for granted, assuming it was endless, like a well that would never run dry. They forgot the cost of every sacrifice, the sleepless nights, the broken body, the money I never spent on myself. In their eyes, my generosity was not love, but duty, something expected, not appreciated. Instead of pride, I became invisible. Instead of gratitude, I received indifference. Still, I held on to hope, because a father's heart does not stop loving simply because it is ignored. I thought that no matter how the world changed, the bond of blood would remain unbroken. I imagined my old age would be different. I pictured myself sitting in the same home, surrounded by grandchildren, hearing laughter, receiving respect, and being told stories of how much I had done. I thought they would fight over who would care for me, who would give me the comfort I had once given them. I believed I would be safe. But belief is a fragile thing when the truth begins to show itself. What I thought would be my security became my undoing. What I thought would bring me peace became the very reason they began to see me as a burden. My kindness was not remembered, my sacrifice was not honored. My whole life of giving became nothing but a shadow in their memory, easily forgotten, easily ignored. And so, in my old age, I found myself not cherished, but discarded. The comfortable home I built with calloused hands became a place where I walked on eggshells. The very family I carried through hardship looked at me as if I was excess, as if I had overstayed my welcome in a life that belonged more to them than to me. The safety net I spent decades weaving was turned into a rope they tied around my neck, pulling tighter with every insult, every dismissal, every cruel act. They had grown comfortable, too comfortable, forgetting the foundation upon which their comfort stood. It is a terrible thing to realize that the people you bled for see you not as a father, but as a burden. Yet even in those moments of cruelty, I held on to the memory of who I once was and what I had given. Because no matter what they chose to see, I knew the truth. I was the reason they lived in security, the reason they stood where they stood. My sacrifices were carved into the walls of that house, even if they chose to look away. Cruelty never arrives all at once. It begins like a whisper, small enough to ignore, subtle enough to excuse. At first, it was in their eyes. Glances exchanged when I moved too slowly. Looks that spoke louder than words, filled with irritation rather than care. Then came the sighs, sharp and impatient, when I asked them to repeat something I hadn't heard clearly. They dismissed it as nothing, but I felt the weight of those sighs pressing against my chest. Slowly, the whispers turned into comments. They would mutter about how much food I ate, as though every spoonful stolen from the pot was a crime. I would hear them joke about how many pills I took, how much money was spent on my medicines, how I had become expensive to keep alive. I brushed it off at first, telling myself they were tired, stressed, and perhaps speaking without thought. But deep inside, I felt the sting. The cruelty grew bolder with time. They no longer bothered to lower their voices. I became the subject of their conversations even while sitting in the same room. They spoke of me as if I were not there, as if I were invisible. He's getting weaker. He's slowing us down. He's draining everything. Those were the phrases I heard more and more, until they echoed in my mind even when the house was quiet. Meals became tense moments. If I reached for an extra piece of bread, I caught their glares. If I asked for tea, I heard their groans. What was once given with love was now provided with resentment, like a debt they were forced to pay. My frailty, the natural decline of age, became ammunition for their mockery. If I dropped a spoon, they laughed. If I struggled to get up from a chair, they imitated my movements, turning my weakness into a performance. At night, I heard their whispers behind closed doors. They spoke about me not as a father, not as a man, but as a burden chained to their lives. Their words, sharp and merciless, cut deeper than any knife. It was as though every sacrifice I had made had been erased, replaced by nothing more than the inconvenience of my existence. I began to feel the walls of the house closing in, not because of bricks and mortar, but because of the coldness of hearts around me. I walked carefully, spoke less, and tried to shrink into the background, hoping to avoid their irritation. Yet, even my silence became fuel for their cruelty. They would sneer that I sat around useless, that I contributed nothing. I wanted to remind them of the decades I had given, of the house they lived in, of the meals they ate, of the comfort they enjoyed, all built on the sweat of my back. But I stayed silent, swallowing the words, believing that silence would keep peace. The cruelty grew into arguments. Small disagreements turned into storms of anger directed at me. If I forgot something, they called me senile. If I coughed too much, they shouted about sleepless nights. If I asked for help, they said I was lazy. They no longer saw me as a father who once carried them through life, but as dead weight pulling them down. I saw it in their eyes, felt it in their tone, heard it in their laughter. And the most painful part was that it was not just one member of the family. It spread through them all, as though disrespect had become contagious. Day by day, I felt myself fading in their presence. Not because age was taking me, but because they were erasing me. Their cruelty was not always loud. Sometimes it was the silence, the refusal to meet my gaze, the deliberate act of speaking over me, of making me invisible in my own home. Other times it was loud and brutal, words hurled like stones, laughter that cut into my dignity. What once was my sanctuary, the home I had built with my hands, became a prison of humiliation. The warmth I dreamed of in my old age turned cold, replaced by bitterness from those I loved most. Each insult was a reminder that my sacrifices were not just forgotten, they were despised. I began to understand the truth. In their eyes, I was no longer a father, no longer a man, no longer a provider. I was simply a problem to be managed, a mouth to feed, a shadow that lingered too long. And that was the beginning of their cruelty, the slow transformation of love into contempt until the day it erupted into something far worse. The day it happened is burned into my memory like a scar that will never fade. It began with a simple disagreement, nothing unusual, nothing that should have escalated. I had asked for a little more food at dinner, and my request was met with sharp remarks about waste and greed. Voices rose, anger flared, and before I knew it, words were hurled at me like stones. They accused me of draining them, of being nothing but a burden, of stealing from their lives by simply existing under their roof. I sat in silence, letting the storm of words crash over me. But silence did not save me that night. Their anger needed an outlet, and I became the target not just of insults but of action. I was told to stand, and though my body ached, I obeyed. I thought they were sending me to my room, that the argument would end with slammed doors and bitter silence. But instead, they pushed me down the hall toward the bathroom. At first, I was confused. Then, before I could react, I heard the sound of the lock snapping shut from the outside. I reached for the handle, turned it desperately, but it did not move. The door was sealed. My own family, my blood, had locked me inside a small, cold room as though I were a prisoner, an intruder, something less than human. The first hour passed with disbelief. I knocked, I called out, thinking they would return, that they would let me out once their anger cooled. But instead of footsteps of rescue, I heard laughter from the other side. They joked, they talked, they carried on with their evening as though I were nothing. I pressed my ear to the door and heard them laugh about how quiet the house would be now, how they would not have to serve me, how I could sit in there until I learned my place. My heart sank deeper than my stomach, because in their laughter I understood the truth. They had done this not in anger alone, but with cruelty, with intent, as if it were a game. As the hours stretched, hunger began to gnaw at me. I had not eaten since dinner, and now even water was beyond my reach. The cold tiles beneath me stole the warmth from my body, and the small window above let in only a sliver of light. Time became a blur. The second day arrived, and my body screamed for food, for water, for freedom. My lips cracked with thirst, my stomach twisted in pain, my head grew light from weakness. I tried to sleep, but the hardness of the floor and the ache in my bones gave me no rest. Every time I closed my eyes, I dreamed of the table outside, of the meals I once worked so hard to provide for them, meals now denied to me as punishment. The humiliation was worse than the hunger. I had built that home with my hands, brick by brick, sacrifice by sacrifice. And now, within its walls, I was treated not as the father who gave everything, but as a prisoner shut away like filth. I had endured insults, endured mockery, but this act stripped me bare of all dignity. Locked in that bathroom, I was not a man, not a father, not even a burden. I was nothing to them, just something to be discarded, silenced, forgotten for their comfort. I listened through the door as life went on without me. I heard laughter, the clatter of dishes, the sound of television. They were not grieving, not concerned. They were free of me, even if only for 2 days, and they relished it. That was the cruelest part, not just the act itself, but their joy in it. Their laughter seeped through the cracks of the door like poison, reminding me again and again of the depth of their cruelty. When they finally opened the door, not with remorse but with irritation, I stumbled out weak, dizzy, and hollow. They looked at me with eyes that carried no guilt, no shame, only annoyance that I still stood before them. In their minds, I had deserved it. In their minds, locking me away was not cruelty, but justice for daring to ask for more. But in that moment of despair, something changed in me. Their brutal act did not just humiliate me. It awoke something they had long forgotten. They thought they had broken me. But what they had really done was remind me of the truth. I was not powerless. I still held something stronger than their cruelty. I held their secrets. When the door finally creaked open and I stumbled out of that cold prison they called a bathroom, my body felt weak, but my mind was alive in a way it had not been for years. I collapsed onto my bed, my limbs trembling from hunger and thirst, yet the ache in my stomach was nothing compared to the ache in my heart. I stared at the ceiling, and for the first time in a long time, I allowed myself to replay my entire life. Memory after memory rushed through me, not as comfort, but as a knife, cutting deeper with every thought. I saw myself working long hours, coming home late, drenched in sweat and dirt, but still smiling when I saw my children asleep safely under the roof I built. I saw the nights I walked miles to save money for their schooling, the mornings I patched my boots so I could afford their books. I remembered how many times I chose silence over argument, sacrifice over comfort, believing love would carry me forward. All of those sacrifices stood before me like ghosts, and they asked me the same question. Was it worth it? As I lay there, I realized that in their eyes, everything I had done meant nothing. To them, I was no longer the provider, no longer the protector, no longer the foundation of the home. I was simply old, fragile, expendable. They had erased decades of sacrifice with one brutal act. Locking me away without food or water for 2 days was not just cruelty. It was the final proof that they had crossed a line that could never be forgiven. And I sat in silence, letting that realization sink deeper into my bones. I thought of the nights I went without food so they could eat, and now they had locked me away to starve. I thought of the years I spent working to keep a roof above their heads, and now that same roof had become my prison. I thought of the promises I made to myself. That family would be my greatest legacy, and now that family had turned into my greatest humiliation. The tiles of the bathroom floor had been cold, but the coldness of their laughter was worse. Even in my reflection, I could still hear it. That laughter, muffled through the door, carefree and mocking, as though my suffering was entertainment. They had not locked me in silence. They had locked me in humiliation, and that humiliation festered in my chest, twisting into something harder, sharper. It was not anger, not yet. It was clarity. A father's love can endure much, disrespect, disappointment, even betrayal. But there comes a moment when love is no longer enough to cover the wounds. That moment had come for me. I began to think differently. Instead of seeing myself as powerless, I began to see myself as patient. Instead of seeing their cruelty as the end, I began to see it as the beginning of something they would never expect. They believed they had broken me in those 2 days, but what they had really done was give me the time to remember what I carried in silence. In the years when I had been their shield, I had also been their witness. I had seen the lies, the schemes, the shady dealings they thought were hidden. I had kept documents safe, tucked away not for revenge, but for protection. I had told myself I would never use them, that family secrets must remain buried. But as I sat reflecting, I realized those secrets were not mine to protect anymore. They had taken my love, my sacrifices, and turned them into chains. Now it was time to break those chains with the truth. My reflection was not loud. It was not filled with shouting or tears. It was quiet, steady, deliberate. I understood then that despair can either crush a man or sharpen him. In that silence, I was sharpened. I made no noise, but inside, I built my resolve. They had locked me in a bathroom for 2 days without food, and in doing so, they had unlocked something inside me far stronger than their cruelty. They had awakened my will to act, to stop being silent, to show them that even in old age, a father is not powerless. For years, I had carried the weight of silence not because I was blind, but because I was loyal. A father sees more than he lets on, and though they believed I was too old, too frail, too slow to notice their ways, I had always been watching. I knew their habits, their dealings, their lies. I knew the faces they showed to the outside world were carefully painted masks, hiding the rot that spread beneath. I had told myself it was not my place to expose them, that blood was thicker than truth, that my role was to protect even when they did not deserve it. But after those 2 days in the bathroom, my perspective changed. I no longer saw my silence as loyalty. I saw it for what it had become. Chains they had bound around me. Chains I now had the strength to break. The truth was this. My family was not as clean as they pretended. Over the years, I had stumbled upon things they thought were hidden. Unpaid taxes tucked away in dusty files, Fraudulent documents buried under stacks of receipts, shady property dealings disguised in complicated contracts. I found letters that revealed affairs they swore never happened. I saw bank statements that did not match their words. I heard phone calls they thought I could not understand. I knew where their money came from, where it went, and who helped them hide what they did not want others to see. They underestimated me because of my age, because of my quiet nature, because I rarely spoke. But I listened, I observed, I remembered, and slowly, I gathered. I had documents locked away, tucked in a small box in the corner of my room. I kept them not because I intended to use them, but because something in me always whispered that the day might come when truth would be the only weapon left. For years, I guarded that box like a secret of my own, never touching it, never speaking of it. Each paper inside was a piece of evidence, each record a reminder of the things they thought buried. I had proof of unpaid debts, of money laundered through fake accounts, of illegal agreements written in their own hands. I had enough to ruin reputations, to freeze assets, to bring law down on them harder than any argument ever could. What they forgot was that while they mocked me as old and useless, I had lived long enough to see their rise built on fragile lies. They forgot that while they called me weak, I was still the man who had built their foundation. They forgot that fathers do not just give, they also protect. And sometimes that protection includes keeping dangerous truths silent. For years, I believed silence was my duty. But after the humiliation they dealt me, I realized silence had become betrayal. Betrayal of myself, betrayal of justice, betrayal of the dignity I still deserved. Sitting in my room after those 2 days, I touched the box with trembling hands. My fingers brushed against the old wood, the lock cold under my skin. Inside lay years of secrets they thought forgotten. And as I opened it, the sight of those papers gave me strength. Each page was a weapon sharper than any blade, more powerful than any insult. They had mocked my frailty, but in my hands I held the power to dismantle everything they had built. Their wealth, their pride, their false respectability. It all rested on a foundation of lies. And I, the father they thought powerless, was the one who could bring it all crashing down. For the first time in years, I felt no despair, no sadness. I felt clarity. They had locked me in a bathroom and laughed as though I were nothing. But in their arrogance, they had forgotten the truth. They had secrets. I had proof. And I had finally found the will to use it. The moment I lifted those papers from the box, I knew there was no going back. For years, I had carried them like a silent burden, tucked away in shadows, convincing myself they were too heavy to ever reveal. But now, after being locked like an animal in my own house, starved for 2 days while laughter filled the rooms beyond the bathroom door, the weight of those papers no longer felt like a burden. They felt like justice, waiting to breathe. I spread them across my small wooden table, page after page, document after document, each one a shard of glass cutting into the false image my family projected to the world. Fraudulent signatures stared back at me. Tax evasion records lay plain. Bank slips revealed money that was never declared. Letters exposed affairs hidden under lies. Every page was a nail, and together they built a coffin strong enough to bury their arrogance forever. I sat in silence, letting the evidence speak louder than my thoughts. I thought of the years I spent working for them, feeding them, raising them, protecting them. I thought of the love I had carried in my chest, love that made me stay silent when I should have spoken. And then I thought of the bathroom, the lock, the hunger, the humiliation, and I realized silence had cost me everything. My loyalty had not earned me respect. It had earned me chains. My patience had not bought me peace. It had bought me humiliation. My love had not protected me. It had blinded me. And in that moment, I decided the blindness would end. I did not rage. I did not cry. I did not shout promises of revenge into the night. My decision was colder, sharper, more deliberate than that. I would not meet their cruelty with cruelty. I would not meet their violence with violence. I would meet it with truth. The truth they thought buried. The truth I had kept safe. The truth that would dismantle their lives from the inside out. They had mocked me as powerless. But power is not in fists or anger. Power is in knowledge, in patience, in timing. And I had all three in my hands that night. I gathered every piece carefully, sorting them into neat piles, binding them so they would not scatter. I placed them back in the box, not as secrets this time, but as weapons ready for battle. Then I sat back, my frail body trembling, my breath steady, my mind clear. Tomorrow, I told myself, the silence ends. Tomorrow, I would no longer be the old man they could lock away. Tomorrow, I would be the father who had chosen truth over blood. That decision filled me with a calm I had not felt in years. The despair that had eaten me during those 2 days without food, the humiliation that had crushed me under its weight, all of it gave way to a quiet strength. I did not fear what would happen once the truth came out. I did not fear their anger, their shouts, their hatred. What more could they do to me that they had not already done? They had stripped me of dignity, but I had rebuilt it with resolve. They had locked me in darkness, but I carried the light of their secrets. They had starved me, but I was now full of purpose. When morning came, I rose slowly, my bones aching, but my spirit unshaken. I looked at myself in the mirror, at the lined face of an old man who had given everything, endured everything, and yet still stood. I whispered not words of doubt, but words of certainty. It ends today. And with that, I picked up the box, pressed it firmly under my arm, and prepared to step out of silence forever. The morning air felt heavy when I stepped outside, but in my chest I carried a lightness I had not known in decades. The box tucked beneath my arm seemed to weigh nothing, though inside it lay the destruction of everything my family thought they had secured. My legs ached as I walked slowly down the road, but every step was steady, deliberate, fueled not by anger, but by purpose. I had no car, no companion, no one to lean on, yet I did not need any of that. All I needed was the truth I carried and the will to place it in the right hands. When I reached the police station, I paused for a moment at the door. The building stood tall and unwelcoming, its walls gray and its windows cold. For a second, the weight of hesitation touched me. This was my family, my blood. To hand over their secrets was to sever ties that could never be mended. But then the memories came rushing back. The lock clicking on the bathroom door, the sound of their laughter as I cried for water, the hunger twisting in my stomach while they feasted outside. Any doubt dissolved. Blood may bind, but respect is what holds a family together. They had broken that bond long ago. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The air smelled of paper, ink, and authority. Officers moved about, some busy with reports, others speaking into phones. I walked to the front desk, my steps slow but unwavering. The officer behind the counter looked up, his expression a mix of curiosity and politeness. I set the box down with trembling hands, not from fear, but from age, and told him I had something important, something that needed to be seen. He gestured for me to sit, and soon another officer arrived, then another, until I was led into a room with a plain table and chairs. There, I opened the box. One by one, I laid out the documents, the letters, the bank slips, the fraudulent contracts. The room grew quiet as the officers scanned the pages, their brows furrowing deeper with every line they read. I spoke slowly, carefully, recounting what I knew. I told them about the unpaid taxes, the false signatures, the secret accounts. I told them about the deals made in shadows, the crimes hidden under layers of respectability. And finally, I told them about myself, the old man who had been locked away in his own home, starved for 2 days by the very family these papers implicated. The officers listened in silence. Some shook their heads in disbelief, others exchanged glances heavy with recognition of the seriousness of what I brought. I did not plead for sympathy. I did not cry for pity. I simply presented the truth and ended with words that carried the weight of both my humiliation and my justice. They locked me away like a prisoner. Now let the law lock them away. Those words lingered in the air. One officer nodded, another gathered the papers, and soon the quiet room filled with movement. Calls were made, files were copied, evidence was logged. I watched as the wheels of justice began to turn, slow but unstoppable. For years, I had carried their secrets in silence. Now those secrets no longer belonged to me. They belonged to the law. When I left the station, the sun had risen higher, casting light across the road before me. My body was weak, but my heart was stronger than it had ever been. I knew what would follow. Raids, investigations, courtrooms, exposure. They would deny, they would scream, they would try to twist the truth. But no matter how loud they became, the documents would speak louder. The truth had been set free, and nothing could chain it again. It did not take long for the storm to arrive. Within days of handing over the evidence, the quiet streets outside my home were filled with the sound of engines, the glare of flashing lights, and the sharp voices of officers executing their duty. Police cars lined the road, vans pulled up to the gates, and uniformed men poured into the very house that had once been my prison. Neighbors peeked from behind curtains, their whispers carried on the wind, curiosity and shock spreading like fire. For years, my family had strutted proudly through this neighborhood, dressed in fine clothes, speaking with authority, admired for their apparent success. But now that mask shattered. Their home, built on lies, became a scene of public disgrace. I stood at a distance, watching silently as the doors were flung open and drawers were emptied. Boxes of documents were carried out, computers seized, safes cracked open. Officers moved with efficiency, gathering evidence piece by piece, each item a nail in the coffin of my family's false empire. My children, once arrogant and untouchable, stood pale and trembling, their voices raised in desperate protests that carried no weight. They shouted of mistakes, of misunderstandings, of innocence. But the officers ignored them, their focus fixed only on the truth in front of them. The laughter I once heard behind the locked bathroom door was gone now, replaced by frantic voices begging for mercy they had never shown me. Word spread quickly. Within hours, the community knew. Within days, the city knew. Headlines carried their names, not as figures of respect, but as criminals exposed. Fraud, tax evasion, corruption, the charges mounted, each one heavier than the last. Accounts were frozen, properties seized, reputations destroyed. The businesses they boasted about collapsed overnight as partners cut ties and customers fled. Friends who once filled their gatherings disappeared, unwilling to be associated with scandal. The family that mocked me as powerless now stood stripped of everything, their pride turned into chains, their arrogance dragged into the courts. I did not gloat. I did not raise my voice in victory. I watched quietly, as I had always done, letting justice play its part. There was no need for me to add words. The evidence spoke louder than I ever could. Their downfall was not a rumor, not a whisper, not an accusation that could be denied. It was fact, printed on paper, stamped with the seal of law. They tried to deny, to twist, to point fingers at one another, but every denial unraveled as quickly as it was spoken. Lies have short legs, and the truth I carried had finally caught them. Courtrooms became their new stage, not the dining halls where they once laughed at me. Judges replaced their audience, lawyers replaced their guests. And instead of applause or admiration, they faced only condemnation. I sat in the back, frail but steady, listening as their secrets were read aloud for all to hear. Each revelation was a mirror they could not escape, each verdict a reflection of the lives they had built on deceit. Their heads hung low, their once proud voices reduced to whispers. The same family that had mocked me for being old and weak now looked weaker than I had ever been, crumbling under the weight of their own lies. The humiliation they had given me was returned to them 100-fold. I had been locked away in silence. Now they were exposed in public shame. I had been starved of food. Now they were starved of reputation, wealth, and respect. They had laughed at my weakness. Now the world laughed at their downfall. Every cruelty they had shown me returned to them, not by my hand, but by the justice they had believed would never touch them. And in that moment, watching them stripped of everything, I understood something profound. Revenge does not always come with anger or fists. Sometimes it comes with truth, steady and patient, waiting for its time. And when that time arrives, it destroys more completely than any rage ever could. When the dust finally settled, the silence around the house was louder than any storm. The police had come and gone, the raids completed, the documents seized, and the damage done. The family that once walked proudly through the neighborhood now hid behind closed doors, afraid of the stares, afraid of the whispers. Neighbors who once greeted them with smiles now crossed the street to avoid them. Relatives who once praised their success now spoke in hushed tones of shame. The respect they had demanded for years evaporated overnight, leaving only disgrace in its place. Their assets were gone. Bank accounts frozen, properties seized, businesses shut down. The cars they flaunted were towed away one by one, leaving the driveway empty and bare. The clothes they once bought with stolen money now hung useless in closets, symbols of a life that had collapsed. Even inside the home, the air was heavy with despair. The children no longer laughed, they whispered in fear. The adults no longer mocked, they argued, pointing fingers, blaming one another for the ruin. The walls echoed with the very chaos they once thought they controlled. I sat quietly through it all, no longer a prisoner, no longer silenced. I did not shout. I did not remind them of what they had done to me. I did not need to. The punishment was all around them. Every newspaper headline, every frozen account, every neighbor's glance was a reminder that their secrets had come to light. They had tried to bury me in humiliation, but instead they had buried themselves in shame. The aftermath was not just financial, it was social, emotional, spiritual. Their name, once carried with pride, was now spoken with disgust. Invitations stopped coming, friends vanished, even their closest allies abandoned them, unwilling to be dragged down by the scandal. They were alone, exposed, left to face the ruins of their choices. And for the first time, I saw fear in their eyes. Not fear of me, but fear of the truth they could no longer escape. As for me, I felt something I had not felt in years. Peace. Not joy, not celebration, but peace. I no longer carried their secrets. I no longer carried the weight of silence. I had given everything for them in life, and in return, they had locked me away without food or water. But in the end, it was not their cruelty that defined me. It was my choice to act, to expose, to let justice speak louder than revenge. My dignity, once stripped from me, was restored not by their apologies, but by the truth. The aftermath left them broken, but it left me free. Free from silence, free from fear, free from the chains of loyalty to those who had none for me. And as I watched the empire they had built on lies crumble into dust, I knew one thing with absolute certainty: they would never laugh at my suffering again. In the quiet that followed, I found myself sitting alone once more. But this time the silence was different. It was not the silence of being locked away, starved and forgotten. It was the silence of peace, the kind that comes when justice has been served and the weight of years has finally lifted from weary shoulders. I had been humiliated, treated as less than human, locked in a bathroom like a prisoner. But in the end, I was the one who unlocked the truth, and that truth was stronger than any cruelty they had shown me. My family had laughed as I begged for food and water. They had mocked me when I was weak. They had stripped me of dignity in the house I built with my own hands. Yet in their arrogance, they forgot the most important thing. A father always remembers. I remembered every sacrifice, every late-night shift, every debt paid for their sake. And I also remembered every dark secret they thought I was too old to notice. It was those memories, those records, those documents that became my voice when theirs had silenced me. Justice did not arrive in anger or in violence. It arrived in paperwork, in evidence, in the cold, unshakable truth. It arrived in flashing police lights, in seized assets, in courtrooms where their names were dragged through mud. They lost everything they had stolen, everything they had flaunted, everything they believed made them untouchable. Their laughter turned to silence, their pride to shame, their power to nothing. And me? I gained back what they tried to take away, my dignity. I no longer lived as their prisoner, no longer carried their secrets in silence, no longer feared the cruelty of my own blood. I had shown them, and the world, that even in old age, even when mocked, even when humiliated, a father is never powerless. I chose truth over loyalty, Justice over silence. And in doing so, I reminded them of who I truly was. Final thought. They locked me in a bathroom without food. I unlocked their darkest secrets. They tried to strip me of dignity, but I stripped them of everything. And that was my justice.